Dr. Isaac Rowe, a brilliant but isolated scientist, was always fascinated by the boundaries of reality. He believed that with the right formula, he could unlock the secret to parallel dimensions, a door into infinite realities. After years of work, he had finally created a machine capable of manipulating quantum states, something he dubbed the quantum cascade. Isaac had dedicated years to the project, often at the expense of his own relationships. He was distanced from friends, estranged from family, and had sacrificed a marriage that had once meant the world to him. The irony was clear. He wanted to explore infinity but couldn't find balance in his own life. And tonight, alone in his sterile, dimly lit lab, he prepared to test his machine. His heart pounded as he programmed the quantum cascade to create a small, controllable ripple, a brief opening of a gateway. Isaac had run the calculations thousands of times, knowing the risks involved. But as he pulled the lever, he didn't anticipate the exact consequence. The machine hummed, vibrating until it felt as if the entire lab was shaking. A flash of light erupted, and Isaac instinctively shielded his eyes. When he opened them, he was still there. At least, it seemed that way. He felt his own pulse, his own breath. But there was another Isaac standing directly across from him, looking just as bewildered. "Who?" the other Isaac began, trailing off as the reality of their situation dawned on both of them. They spoke in unison, a symphony of shock and realization. "What have we done?" The two Isaacs stared at each other, their minds racing to process the impossible. It was as if they were looking into a mirror, but one with depth, consciousness, a living reflection. "What just happened?" Isaac 1 asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Isaac 2 shook his head, visibly shaken. "The quantum cascade. It didn't just open a portal. It made another me." Both Isaacs shared a brief moment of fear and awe. The equations had never indicated this would be the outcome. They had theorized about glimpsing into parallel worlds, maybe even communicating with alternate selves through some quantum medium. But this was different. This was real. "Okay," Isaac 1 said, his voice steadying, "we need to shut it down before." Another flash. They turned to see a third Isaac standing in the room, equally dazed, then a fourth. Each new arrival wore the same expression of shock and horror, realizing what had occurred. Within moments, there were 5 Isaacs in the lab, all exchanging glances of confusion and unease. "What have we done?" one of the Isaacs muttered, echoing the earlier sentiment. It was then that the machine started humming louder, as if feeding on their very presence. Isaac 1 ran to the control panel and pressed the shutdown command, but the machine didn't respond. Instead, it emitted a low, rhythmic thrum, pulsing like a heartbeat, each beat ushering in a new Isaac. By the time the thrum faded, there were 20 Isaacs in the room. Some were pacing, others muttering to themselves, but all shared the same growing fear. They had unlocked something uncontrollable, a cascade that wasn't just a one-time occurrence, but a continual duplication, each version as real as the last. Isaac 7 spoke up. "If this keeps going, we're going to overrun the lab in minutes. We need a plan." "But how?" Isaac 15 replied. "I don't even understand why this is happening. The equations never suggested." Isaac 12 interrupted. "Maybe the calculations were off. Maybe the machine's quantum manipulation isn't just opening doors, it's creating new iterations of us, in the same reality." The Isaacs were scientists to their core, and their minds naturally turned to problem-solving despite the absurdity of the situation. Isaac 1 organized the group, designating roles to try to understand and, if possible, stop the quantum cascade. As they scrambled, it became clear that each Isaac, though identical in origin, began to display subtle differences. Some were more anxious, others calm and analytical. Some argued for shutting down the machine at all costs, while others hesitated, wondering if they could control this discovery instead of destroying it. Then, one of the Isaacs, Isaac 17, voiced a chilling thought. "What if each of us isn't just a copy, but an alternate version of Isaac Rowe? Each of us representing a different decision, a different mindset?" Silence fell over the room. It was a terrifying prospect. If they were alternate versions of Isaac, then each was tied to a different branch of choices. It would mean that somewhere in the quantum fabric, every decision, every what-if moment had created its own Isaac. Are we all even real? Isaac 4 whispered. The existential weight of that question settled over them, tightening the atmosphere with dread. Each Isaac began to wonder if he was the original or just another in a series of infinite selves, each bound by the same memories, same fears, same ambitions. The question of identity, of self, became overwhelming. Isaac 3, feeling the burden of that existential dread, clutched his head. We're losing control. If we can't stop the cascade, there might be thousands of us. As if in response, the machine began humming louder again. The threat of more Isaacs crowding the room, and perhaps even the entire world, was now imminent. Isaac 1 gathered himself. We have to destroy the machine. Now. A wave of protest erupted from a few Isaacs who thought they could contain and study the phenomenon. To them, this was an unprecedented discovery, a scientific marvel. But Isaac 1's voice cut through. If we don't stop it, it could lead to an infinite cascade. There's no telling what could happen if thousands, even millions of versions of us keep appearing. This could collapse reality itself. Reluctantly, most Isaacs agreed. They worked together, pooling their knowledge to attempt a shutdown protocol. But as they dove deeper, they discovered the machine was locked into a feedback loop. Every attempt to stop it seemed to only amplify the quantum cascade. Maybe, Isaac 14 said, hesitating. Maybe one of us has to go inside. The room fell silent. The idea was dangerous, reckless even, but there was logic to it. If one Isaac entered the core of the machine, they might be able to disrupt the cascade from within. Isaac 1 nodded slowly. It's a suicide mission. Isaac 9 stepped forward. I'll go. Isaac 1 felt a pang of something. He wasn't sure if it was relief or guilt. Watching another version of himself volunteer, he felt like he was glimpsing his own courage, his own willingness to sacrifice. It was both humbling and deeply unsettling. Isaac 9 approached the machine's core, each step heavy with the weight of finality. The other Isaacs watched in silence as he entered the chamber, disappearing behind a wall of circuitry and light. Moments passed, stretching unbearably. And then, the machine's hum grew louder, reaching an ear-splitting crescendo. There was a flash of blinding light, and the machine stopped. Silence engulfed the lab, thick and oppressive. The Isaacs looked around, each realizing the same chilling truth: they were still there. The cascade hadn't ended. And then, slowly, they began to vanish, one by one, dissolving into thin air, as if each reality was collapsing back into itself. Each Isaac felt a pull, an unraveling of existence as they returned to the quantum fabric, leaving only one behind. When the light faded, only Isaac 1 remained, standing alone in the now silent lab. He looked around, feeling the weight of what had happened. Infinite versions of himself, all gone, sacrificed to prevent an unimaginable disaster. The loneliness was overwhelming, but he knew it was the only way. Isaac Rove turned off the machine, sealing the quantum cascade for good. But as he left the lab, he couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere, in the hidden folds of reality, echoes of his other selves might still linger, caught between worlds, existing out of phase with his own. As Isaac Rove left the lab, he was filled with an eerie sense of déjà vu. Every step felt layered, as if he were moving through multiple realities at once. He tried to shake it off, convincing himself that it was just the aftershock of the experiment, the trauma of witnessing his infinite selves blink out of existence. Yet, even as he walked through the quiet corridors of the research facility, strange sensations crept in. Reflections in the windows seemed to lag, showing flashes of alternate versions of himself, Isaacs with different expressions, Isaacs with subtle variations in attire, Isaacs who seemed to be calling out silently, frozen in the reflective surface. He would glance back, expecting to see them directly, but there was nothing. Just the empty, dimly lit corridor and the soft hum of the facility's power systems. The cascade might have ended, but its effects lingered. In the days that followed, Isaac threw himself into mundane tasks, hoping to ground himself in his singular existence. He was haunted, however, by fleeting moments where reality seemed to warp and bend around him. When he walked through his apartment, objects seemed to flicker, shifting between slight variations in color, shape, or placement, as if he were glimpsing parallel versions of his own home. He kept telling himself that it was residual stress, a consequence of pushing the boundaries of quantum mechanics too far. But there was something else. In the quietest hours of the night, when the world seemed to hold its breath, he could hear whispers. Soft, distant, and layered over one another. They weren't clear, but they felt familiar, like fragments of his own voice, stretching across unseen divides. Sometimes, when he focused hard enough, he could make out fragments. You shouldn't have left us. Why did you survive? We're still here. These whispers grew more insistent over time, filling Isaac with a deep-seated dread. It was as if his other selves, the ones he'd seen vanish, hadn't been entirely erased. Instead, they seemed trapped in some liminal state, reaching out to him, blaming him. The idea gnawed at him, disturbing his every thought and action. One evening, unable to ignore the whispers any longer, Isaac returned to the lab. He had dismantled the quantum cascade machine days before, reducing it to its individual components and locking them in secure storage. Yet, something in him, a compulsion he couldn't explain, drew him back to the site of the experiment. As he stepped into the lab, the air felt thicker, weighted with unseen presences. And then he saw it, a faint, translucent figure standing near where the machine once stood. It was himself, or rather, one of his alternate selves, flickering in and out of existence like a weak hologram. Isaac froze, staring at the apparition. "Hello," he whispered, his voice trembling. The figure looked up, its eyes hollow, filled with a kind of sadness and anger that cut through Isaac's soul. It spoke, though its voice sounded like a dozen overlapping whispers. "You left us." Isaac took a step back, the weight of guilt pressing down on him. "I had to. It was the only way to stop the cascade. You would have done the same." The figure's face twisted, as though wrestling with conflicting emotions. "But I didn't. I'm here, and I'm not the only one." As it spoke, other figures began to appear, flickering into existence around the lab. Dozens of Isaacs, each one carrying a unique expression of pain, anger, or confusion. They surrounded him, a ghostly council of his own creation, remnants of the cascade that refused to fade away. Isaac felt his heart pound, panic rising in his chest. I don't know what to say. I thought I was the only one left. I thought you were all gone." The crowd of Isaacs murmured in unison, their whispers blending into a haunting chorus. "We exist between. You anchored us here." Isaac's mind raced, trying to understand. Anchored? How? I didn't mean for this to happen. One of the Isaacs stepped forward, his face calm but stern. Every decision, every divergence, creates a connection. The cascade brought us together, but in stopping it, you also trapped us. Isaac's eyes widened. Then, you're all bound to me? The figures nodded slowly, their expressions a mixture of resignation and resentment. Until you release us. But how? Isaac's voice cracked, desperation evident. I destroyed the machine. I don't know how to undo this. The lead figure extended a hand toward him, shimmering like a mirage. There's another way. You just have to let go. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Isaac knew what they meant, but the thought terrified him. He had to relinquish his hold on his identity, his sense of self, to sever the connection. In doing so, he risked becoming just another fragment, lost in the infinite web of his own possibilities. Isaac closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. If it's the only way, then I'll do it. The ghostly Isaacs surrounded him, forming a circle. One by one, they placed their hands on his shoulders, their touch cold and ethereal. Isaac felt his mind stretch, expand, and unravel, his consciousness merging with theirs. He could see through their eyes, feel their memories, their regrets, their fears. He was becoming them, and they were becoming him, a singular, collective mind encompassing infinite variations. In that moment, he felt a profound peace, as though he were no longer a single entity but part of a vast, interconnected whole. And as he let go of his identity, the quantum echoes around him faded, dissolving back into the fabric of reality. When Isaac opened his eyes, he was alone. The lab was empty, silent. The weight he had carried, the guilt and fear, had dissipated. He felt lighter, as though he were a new person, or perhaps, a fusion of all the Isaacs who had existed before. He took a deep breath, stepping out of the lab and into the night. The stars above seemed clearer, brighter, as though they too had been watching, waiting for him to release the burden he'd carried. Isaac Rowe walked into the darkness, uncertain of what he had become, but resolute in his understanding. He was no longer just one Isaac, he was all of them, unified, reborn, and at peace with the infinite possibilities that had once haunted him. Isaac staggered out of the lab, feeling his mind swimming with echoes. Each step he took felt foreign, like he was relearning how to exist in his own skin. He thought the connection had been severed, that he was finally alone. But as he made his way back to his apartment, an unsettling sensation simmered beneath his skin, as if fragments of his other selves lingered, whispering just below the surface of his thoughts. Once inside, he slumped onto his couch, exhausted, hoping a night's sleep would silence the echoes once and for all. But when he closed his eyes, he was plunged into a vivid, unsettling dreamscape. Isaac found himself standing in a vast, empty void, surrounded by an endless expanse of mirrors. Each mirror showed a different version of himself, some older, some younger, some with scars he didn't recognize, some with cold, unyielding expressions that unsettled him. They all stared back at him, their gazes piercing, as if they were blaming him, questioning him. Suddenly, one of the mirrored versions of himself stepped out of the glass. This Isaac looked exactly like him but had a menacing aura, his eyes dark and calculating. He walked up to Isaac, his face twisting into a mocking smile. "You think it's over?" the mirror Isaac sneered. "You think you can just walk away?" Isaac took a step back, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. I severed the connection. You're all gone." The mirror Isaac laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "You can't get rid of us that easily. We're part of you now. Every choice you make, every step you take, we're there. Watching. Waiting." Isaac's heart raced. "What do you want from me?" The mirror Isaac leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper. "To remind you that you'll never be alone again. We're bound to you, Isaac. Forever." Isaac jolted awake, gasping for breath, his heart hammering against his ribs. Sweat soaked his shirt, and his hands trembled. He looked around his apartment, reassuring himself that he was alone, that it was just a nightmare. But the unease lingered, gnawing at him. In the following days, Isaac tried to return to his normal life, immersing himself in his work, avoiding the lab where the experiment had taken place. Yet, strange things began happening. Objects in his apartment would shift positions when he wasn't looking. He'd catch glimpses of movement in the corner of his eye, only to turn and find nothing there. And the whispers, they never stopped. One night, he was sitting at his desk, going over research notes, when he felt a presence behind him. He turned, but the room was empty. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Then, his computer screen flickered, and words began to appear, typed out by an unseen force. *, we're here, Isaac. You can't ignore us. *. Isaac's blood ran cold. His hand shook as he reached for the keyboard, his fingers hovering over the keys. Who are you?" The screen flickered again, and the words shifted. *, we're you. And we want out. *. Isaac's mind raced. He had assumed the quantum cascade had ended, that he was the only one left. But what if he was wrong? What if fragments of his other selves were trapped, lingering in his mind, reaching out from the edges of reality? Desperation clawed at him. How do I get rid of you?" The screen went dark, and for a moment, there was silence. Then, slowly, the words appeared once more. Asterisk, you can't. You opened the door, and now we're all here. You can't just close it. Asterisk. Isaac's vision blurred, his mind unraveling under the weight of it all. He felt himself slipping, his own identity fragmenting as the voices grew louder, overlapping, until he couldn't tell which thoughts were his and which belonged to his other selves. He stumbled back from the desk, clutching his head. No, this isn't real. You're gone. I'm the only one left. A laugh echoed in his mind, cold and mocking. Asterisk, are you? Or are we just hiding, waiting for the right moment? Asterisk. Isaac's knees buckled, and he collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to silence the voices, to push them away. But they were relentless, clawing at the edges of his consciousness, invading his thoughts, his memories. And then, a terrifying realization dawned on him. What if he was just one of the many fragments? What if he was merely another Isaac, trapped in a cycle of endless realities, convinced he was the only one left? What if there was no original Isaac, just an infinite loop of copies, each one believing they were unique, while the others lay dormant, waiting to surface? The thought made him feel sick, his stomach churning with dread. He couldn't trust his own mind, his own memories. He didn't know who he was anymore, or if he had ever been real to begin with. The whispers grew louder, filling his mind with a chaotic symphony of voices, each one demanding to be heard, to take control. And as Isaac lay there, consumed by the cacophony, he realized that he was no longer alone. He was never alone. They were all there, buried deep within him, fragments of an infinite self, locked in a battle for dominance. And in that moment, Isaac understood the terrible truth. He was trapped in a prison of his own making, a fractured soul lost in the quantum web he had created. And no matter how hard he tried to escape, he would always be haunted by the shadows of his other selves, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for their chance to emerge. The nightmare was only beginning. Isaac lay there, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling, feeling the oppressive weight of the other selves within him. The revelation had shaken him to the core. He wasn't original. Maybe there wasn't an original Isaac at all, just endless versions fighting for control in an ever-shifting cascade of identities. As he tried to steady his breathing, he felt a sudden pull, a tug at his consciousness, as if something was trying to draw him out, to make him slip. His vision blurred, and for a fleeting moment, he wasn't in his apartment anymore. He was somewhere else. The room he found himself in was familiar and yet alien, as though it belonged to a version of himself with an entirely different life. Instruments and gadgets cluttered every corner, many of them emitting soft, strange glows. He looked down and realized he was wearing a lab coat he didn't recognize. And yet, somehow, he understood what every piece of equipment did, their designs instinctively familiar. Isaac felt the presence of another in the room. Turning, he came face to face with another version of himself, a man older, grayer, with lines of exhaustion carved into his face. His eyes were haunted, as though he had seen more than any one man should bear. "Is it happening to you too?" the older Isaac asked in a weary voice, as if he already knew the answer. Isaac struggled to speak. You're me. Another me. But why?" The older Isaac gave a bitter smile. "We're not as different as you think. I tried to fix it, just like you did. Tried to sever the cascade, close the door. But once you're aware of us, of all the others, you can't unsee it. They're part of you now. They always will be." Isaac's stomach twisted. "Is there any way out?" The older Isaac's expression softened, a glimmer of sympathy in his eyes. "I've searched for years, tried everything I could think of. Every solution only led to more fractures, more versions. The cascade just adapts. It's like a hydra. Cut off one head, and two more grow in its place." Desperation clawed at Isaac's heart. "There has to be a way. We can't just live like this." The older Isaac placed a hand on his shoulder, his touch surprisingly solid, grounding. "Maybe it's not about getting rid of the others. Maybe it's about learning to live with them. To find balance. Isaac shook his head, rejecting the thought. How can I live with them when they're constantly trying to take control? When I can't even trust my own thoughts? The older Isaac's face twisted with a mixture of sadness and resignation. You're not the first Isaac to ask that question. And you won't be the last. Before he could respond, the room around him began to dissolve, the edges of reality blurring and fading. He felt himself slipping back, being pulled away. He reached out, desperate to hold onto something, anything, but the older Isaac's form faded, disappearing into the haze. When he came to, he was back in his apartment, gasping for air, his heart pounding. The experience left him shaken, more confused than ever. But as he sat up, he noticed something new, a small slip of paper on his desk, written in a handwriting eerily similar to his own. Asterisk, the answer lies within the loop. Asterisk. Isaac stared at the note, trying to decipher its meaning. The loop. Did it refer to the cascade itself? The endless cycle of selves? Or was it something else entirely? The days that followed were a blur of sleepless nights and endless contemplation. He went back to his lab, diving into research with renewed vigor, determined to understand the nature of the loop, of the cascade. He explored quantum theory, parallel dimensions, consciousness, anything that might hold a clue. The voices grew louder, more insistent, each one trying to steer him in a different direction. And then, one night, it clicked. Isaac realized that the cascade wasn't just a random occurrence, it was a reflection of his choices, his fears, his desires. Each version of himself represented a different path, a different possibility. The key wasn't to fight them, but to understand them, to integrate them. He set up an experiment, one final attempt to confront the cascade. He isolated himself in the lab, surrounding himself with the equipment that had sparked this nightmare, configuring it to act as a mirror of his own mind. If he could project his consciousness into the cascade, he might be able to face the other versions directly. Taking a deep breath, he activated the device. A hum filled the air, and Isaac felt his mind being pulled, stretched, fragmented. His vision went dark, and when he opened his eyes, he was standing in an infinite space, surrounded by countless versions of himself, each one flickering in and out of focus. They all turned to look at him, a silent army of Isaacs, each with their own story, their own pain, their own regrets. One stepped forward, a version with tired eyes and a haunted expression. "Why have you brought us here?" Isaac took a shaky breath, feeling the weight of their stares. "I came to understand. To make peace." The tired Isaac's gaze softened. "Peace? After everything we've been through?" Isaac nodded, his voice filled with quiet determination. "We're fragments of the same whole. If we keep fighting, we'll tear ourselves apart. But if we can work together, find common ground, maybe we can create something new. Something stronger." There was a long silence. The other Isaacs looked at each other, expressions flickering with doubt, hope, fear. Finally, one by one, they nodded, a silent acceptance rippling through the crowd. Isaac closed his eyes, feeling their presence merging with his own, a sense of unity, of wholeness. The cacophony faded, replaced by a quiet hum, a balance he hadn't felt in ages. When he opened his eyes, he was back in his lab, the hum of the machine dying down. He took a deep breath, feeling different. Whole. The echoes were still there, but they no longer clawed at his mind, no longer fought for dominance. He had found the loop, the balance. And though the journey had been harrowing, he had come out the other side, stronger and more complete than ever. But as he left the lab, a faint whisper lingered in the back of his mind, a reminder that the cascade was still there, a part of him, waiting in the shadows. And he knew, deep down, that he would never be truly alone again. Isaac left the lab feeling lighter but remained aware of the change within him. For the first time, he no longer felt like he was being pulled apart. Instead, the cascade, the countless versions of himself, had become a source of strength, a silent counsel, and inner unity. Months passed, and Isaac resumed his work with newfound clarity. He applied his knowledge to solve problems in quantum mechanics, becoming a pioneer in fields he once only dreamed of. The voices were still there, but they were no longer disruptive. They had become guides, offering insights that only a multitude of minds could. Yet, even as he moved forward, he sometimes caught glimpses of his other selves and reflections, faint shadows that watched him with knowing eyes, like ghosts of potential paths. And he felt a comforting warmth from them, knowing they were there, in his mind and in his heart, every step of the way. One evening, as Isaac stood alone on a hill overlooking the city, a strange calm washed over him. In the vast expanse of the sky, he saw his life unfolding, like waves rippling through a sea of stars. He understood now. He was part of a tapestry, one strand among infinite possibilities, but each one was woven together to form a whole. He no longer feared the unknown, for he had faced it, understood it, and embraced it. His journey wasn't over, it would never be over. But he knew that, whatever challenges lay ahead, he was no longer alone. With a final, deep breath, Isaac let go of his fears. And for the first time in years, he felt truly, profoundly, at peace.